The CEO of the Edinburgh Rape Services and all the usual suspects are bound up in this ghoulish tale that continues to pit trans rights against women. Alright, so, a cis male misogynist, a cis woman and a trans woman are sat at a table with a pile of biscuits. The cis man grabs all the biscuits, saves one, and stuffs them into his mouth. He then blurts out to the cis woman through a drizzle of crumbs, "You know you better watch that T-slur. It's got its eye on your biscuit." 2014 was a long time ago now. Bowie was still alive, Trump was still a harmless punchline, Brexit was an unrealistic fever dream, and Denzel Washington was starring in Equalizer. Halcyon days. Laverne Cox was discussing the transgender tipping point with Time magazine, exploring how once overlooked and vulnerable communities suddenly were getting positive attention. Trans men and trans women were being recognized as real, valid, interesting people, and we were getting some media time as a result. Only 2 years later, British Prime Minister and part-time haunted turnip Theresa May thought she could get an easy win by updating Britain's trans-focused policies. The Gender Recognition Act, 2004, allowed trans people to change their gender and have this recognised by the government. And in the 10 years since, there has been much that could be improved. The process was slow, medicalised, dehumanising and expensive, and May, who'd watched her predecessor David Cameron usher in same-gender marriage just 2 years before to great praise, well, she thought this would be another quick win. The UK Conservative Party has a very well-deserved reputation for xenophobia, bigotry, homophobia, transphobia, as well as just general corruption. And same-gender marriage helped to offset that perception. Being a bit nicer to trans people could help that too, right? Right? Oh, honey. Now we're in 2024, and it's time to take a look at provision for abused women in Glasgow, Scotland. There are services specifically for women who have been raped, abused, or are otherwise vulnerable and in danger. And under Scottish law, those services cannot discriminate against the women they help. If a trans woman is raped, she is entitled to the same help and support as a cis woman who has been raped. The person in charge of the rape crisis services in Edinburgh was even a trans woman, someone who understood vulnerable people and would be well placed to offer comfort and succour. Alright, good. Well, vulnerable women get some help. What's the problem then? Not enough funding? Service cutbacks? Some weirdo law that harms their operations? At this point, I must remind you that we live in a timeline where a convicted felon and rapist is set to become US president for the second time, based on his promise to round up and deport 25 million people who, he claims, were eating dogs. Where lying is called alternative fact, where we blame the needy for the greed of big business, and where a racist man-child runs one of the biggest social websites and is set to be a special advisor to the US government. This reality is one step away from becoming Rand McNally, where people wear shoes on their heads and hamburgers eat people. Just off the coast of You Are Gay, if I remember correctly. Of course, the problem isn't cutbacks or funding. It's the transes. You see, what were fringe positions 5 years ago are now completely mainstream wisdom in British politics. In a nutshell, that transness is a fantasy that will be used by bad men to get into women-only spaces. This is the de facto position of West Streeting, Health Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, PM, His Majesty's Opposition led by Kemi Badenoch, most every newspaper in the country, even the liberal-leaning Guardian, and certain pitiless, snatch-faced ghouls who made too much money in the 90s with some poorly written derivative kids' books. It's backed up by the biased Cass Review, which has directly influenced NHS policy and gets a healthy dose of viral energy from social media. The prevailing wind comes from a position of biological determinism. The idea that everything about a person is attributable to their body and, being built of fundamental blocks of DNA and chromosomes, said body is unchangeable. Or, more simply put, men are men and women are women, and they are different and they are always different, and those two sexes represent the entirety of all humanity. That there are exactly two, and those sexes can never change. Further, that everything about a person, from which of those two sexes they are, stems. Men are violent, aggressive, and strong, with at least the potential to rape. Women are passive, calm, and weak. Here's a fun interstitial. Can you guess which projects have also built cases from biological determinism? If you guessed eugenics and scientific racism, you're right. Therefore, goes the reasoning, transness does not exist. Only mentally ill men and women exist. Mentally ill women are not a threat because they are passive, calm, and weak. Mentally ill men are dangerous. This is pretty much where the Conservative Party is now, and Labour are only barely restraining themselves from joining them. When you look at rape crisis provision in Scotland through those terms, then the situation is untenable. A trans woman cannot run the service in Edinburgh. The service in Glasgow must not accept trans people. Women must be protected from trans people. Why did we ever let these potential rapists into spaces set aside for women? Why did we fire an employee just because she is a crock-stirring transphobe with a clearly antagonistic agenda? Hence, the chief exec of Edinburgh's Rape Crisis Centre has left. The Glasgow branch has left the Rape Crisis Scotland group because of its trans-inclusive policies. It's a huge scandal, and many fingers are being pointed to lay blame for this horrible situation. Honestly, first we cost the Democrats in the USA their election by being pandered to with, what was that, zero-hole policies about us? And now this. Under UK law, it is acceptable to discriminate against trans women when doing so achieves a legitimate end. For example, one could run a rape crisis centre and, if circumstances required it, provide a service such that a traumatised person need not come into contact with a trans person. Neither are denied service, the service is just applied differently. Similarly, UK prisons hold broad, in fact, far too broad, powers to put violent or sexual offenders into isolation. They mix with other prisoners only at supervised times, such as meals, and are not allowed to roam free in general population. Those sound like two policies that should allow a prison to handle a trans inmate, such as Karen White. However, the prison screwed it up and then blamed it on her being trans. The debate then became about whether she was allowed to call herself a woman, not how she was dealt with. Roll on a couple of years, and now, no trans woman can go into a women's prison in the UK, even if it is for a non-violent crime such as credit fraud, unless they have had genital reconstruction surgery, because we are not seen as women. All of us are now seen as men who are potential rapists. Here's another fun interstitial. Did you know, even if all trans women did want genital reconstruction surgery, we can't all get it? The waiting lists are long. The operation costs a fortune privately. Many of us have health issues that preclude elective surgery, and some people are just too heavy for the NHS, which is very fatphobic. Now, you would think that these same policies should allow a rape crisis centre to operate in a manner that responds to the needs of the distraught and the traumatised. However, the narrative that's taken root can't accept that. Any trans member of staff must be outed to other staff and patients to avoid them being in a room with a man who is a potential rapist. Any trans woman patient must be outed to avoid women being in a room with a man who is a potential rapist. Trans women must be at least completely segregated to avoid women being in a room with a man who is a potential rapist. You'll notice that sounds very discriminatory, because it is. It is a massive breach of privacy, a huge personal invasion, and, for want of a better word, demented. It calls for broad, prejudicial action against people based on their trans status. That is the definition of prejudice. Because the CEO of Edinburgh Crisis Centre wouldn't sanction revealing staff and/or patient gender identities, she had to be sacked. A gender-critical transphobe who worked at the Glasgow Centre got £70,000 for being sacked when she caused a massive stink demanding to know who was trans. and her opinion is now a protected characteristic, thanks to Maya Forstater. Trans women, in this case, are no longer even viewed with suspicion. We are now just out-and-out threats. First stop, getting us out of services where we can get help for abuse or rape. Second stop, getting us out of hospital wings and public toilets. How we landed at such an extreme position, so lacking in nuance, is complicated. A large portion is because we have an uncritical media landscape. Now by that, best beloved, I don't mean that they don't give politicians a hard time. They do. They love asking questions to make politicians squirm or look foolish. That's part of the game, and politicians play along. What they don't do is hold stories to account based on fact and evidence. What do I mean by that? Well, reports from constituents to a backbench MP have led to headlines about children being shown pornography and taught about gender reassignment. News anchors, editors and reporters are seemingly devoid of any ability to interrogate this. Just as they did during Brexit, they essentially just handed a platform over without requiring any level of due diligence. The fact there's not a shred of evidence to back it up is neither here nor there. And anyway, stuff to do with queer people is juicy. It's about sex, always and forever. The news and media reinforce this association because they benefit from it. Sex sells, and weird sex even more so. Who doesn't want a tasty front page where we talk about how the T-slurs and F-slurs are invading our schools with their indoctrination tactics and ideology? Language is important, and it has been used consistently for many years now to paint queer and trans people as generically bad. An equally large influence is social media. It allows otherwise small fry a soapbox to build up large audiences. There are no requirements to fact-check or verify anything that's been said. I've peppered this video with links to back up the basics of my argument, but I didn't need to do that. Indeed, the more one is appealing to base prejudices, the less one needs evidence. If an audience holds the prejudice, you need only fan it. It needs no further explanation. Most of the gender-critical movement fall into the social influencer bracket. Only one or two have any sort of large-scale audience offline, and even then, they have to write newspaper columns, or author books, or schedule speaking events. What gender-critical positions need is access to an audience that they can shock, surprise, and then recruit. Watch Kaelan Conrad's undercover deep dive into this movement to see firsthand how they operate and what they really think, straight from the horse's mouth. Social media actively encourages and rewards this shock-jock behavior because it drives engagement. Stun people with something, and they're likely to be drawn further in. They'll reshare it, comment, or react in another way. That tells the platform's algorithm that this content is resonating, and so it'll be surfaced more broadly. It's as though someone built a machine to identify the troublemaker in every class and school and automatically give them their own TV show. Newspapers report breathlessly on every Twitter fight twisted billionaire authors get into with actors, or with TV personalities, or with other authors. The very drama itself is the story. How many gender critters would never have been drawn to this movement without this dopamine delivery mechanism of outrage binging? How many of its ostensible leaders would never have bothered getting this worked up over anything if it didn't lead to such attention and influence? Lastly, since the 1980s, the promises of capitalism have evaporated. I'm not going to go full socialist on you, but just look at what we've had. Austerity, cuts, tax rises, recessions, the Great Recession, mortgage defaults, home repossessions, food banks, rent increases, inflation, doubling energy bills. Capitalism was meant to make us all rich if we just worked hard. Well, we're working hard, and only a handful of people have gotten rich. And now those guys don't want to pay their taxes. They channel revenue through Ireland or the Cayman Islands and spend their spare time building rocket ships. And influencing government. Productivity has increased, but is no longer associated with better pay. Inflation has pushed prices up. Companies gouge us for products assembled by slave labor that are designed to fail within a couple of years. Even if we put our biggest set of blinkers on, stuff cotton wool in our ears, and sing as loudly and as off-key as we can, there is no way we're not all, in our bones, unaware of where we are. We might deny it. We might ignore it. We might argue the toss about it, but in our souls we know it's true. We live in a world where tomorrow will probably be harder than today. That 1950s ideal of one person's salary paying for a house, 2 cars, 2 holidays a year, college for the kids, and a chicken roasting in the oven is a joke. Homer Simpson's lifestyle, originally conceived as average or normal, is beyond the reach of most people now. Our economies, business laws, and regulations are complicated. They're beyond me. I can see the system is rotten, but I don't know where to begin replacing it, short of throwing it all away before we destroy the planet. If someone is not of a mind to throw it all away, they're going to be equally lost as to when and how improvements should be made. All they do know is that they're hurting. And when people are hurting, they get mad. It's the old kick the dog trope. A man has a bad day at work, but his boss is too big and too mean for him to say what he feels, so what does the man do? He comes home and kicks the dog. The dog didn't make his working life a misery, but it's the entity in closest proximity that is least likely to retaliate or tell tales. If anyone complains, he'll just say it growled at him and it got what it had coming. This, then, is our world. In the UK, 2023 to 24, around 70,000 rapes were reported. Of these, 1,967 were referred to the Crown Prosecution Service for trial. Of these, 597 resulted in convictions, 0.85%. Rapes are reported by newspapers with quote marks around rape. We care more about the potential, the what if. Maybe the person is innocent and the victim is just making it up for attention. The number of reports thought to be, or found to be false, is about 4%. Women, dragged into court, are asked what they wore. Their phones are passed for anything to discredit them. Were they drinking? Did they flirt? Were they walking home alone? And if so, why? Don't they know that's dangerous? If you go out to a bar, you're supposed to guard your drink so it isn't spiked. You need a network of friends, all looking out for each other. You mustn't walk home alone, or even get a taxi alone. If a cis woman is in an abusive relationship with another cis woman, you can't legally term any bodily violations as rape under British law. If convicted, that abuser will be allowed into a women's prison because she doesn't have a wing-wang. If she's not convicted, she'll be allowed into changing rooms, toilets, schoolyards, and, if needed, rape crisis centres. What then are trans women in this tapestry? Well, we're a dog to kick. It's been made clear that it's okay to kick us, and it'll make you feel better, maybe even make you feel clever. You don't even really need to believe anything. The only requirement is that you don't engage your brain sufficiently to realize human beings do not just do what their genes tell them. They have free will. Trans women need rape crisis help too. 17 were seen by the crisis centre in Scotland last year. It's hardly a tsunami, but it's not zero either. And trans women don't want predators in our spaces either, because we're women. Because we're not predators or freaks. We aren't the threat. We've never been the threat. There is no torrent of predators dressing as women trying to get into toilets. And do you know why? Because a bad man can get into a women's toilet by just putting on overalls and carrying a mop. The little stick figure on the door wearing a dress isn't a magic charm that repels evil. Some trans people are bad. Some women are bad. That doesn't mean you prejudge everyone based on that. The network of outrage horse hockey purveyors is the threat. A justice system that presumes women lie is the threat. A legal system that prioritizes the feelings of men is the threat. An institutionally sexist police force is the threat. Collectively, they have stuffed every biscuit bar one into their maw, and then told cis women, look out for that T-slur. It's after your biscuit.